I clearly need more plants. Have you noticed that millennials often call themselves plant parents as opposed to, for instance, plant owners? I wondered why this is, and this video provides some theories on the subject. So, you're considered a millennial if you were born between 1981 and 1996. And though it's not the case that all millennials are obsessed with plants, and some even kill them on a regular basis by failing to water them, it is still a phenomenon how many millennials turn their homes into jungles. You can especially see this on social media such as YouTube and Instagram, where millennials are proud to have as many plants as they can possibly get. And these jungle homes put my humble collection here to shame. Right. So a possible reason for this obsession with plants could be found in the economic context. You see, millennials are probably the unluckiest generation since the one that lived through both world wars. Because when we hit the job market in 2008, the world economic crisis hit. And then, now that the world has recovered, the corona crisis came around. So we spent most of our early adult life in a state of extreme uncertainty about the future of the world and the future possibilities for our own professional life. Also, we are the first generation since the 19th century that are worse off financially than our parents. So it might be no small wonder that millennials like to create these little cocoons, these little places where they feel in control and where they're able to do this kind of routine work that's always predictable and to feel well in the kind of their own little ecosystem. And many of the millennials in these YouTube videos state that they have plants because they make them happy and they give them a sense of calm, a kind of meditative routine, and a sense of control. The makers of the philosophical podcast Overthink have created an entire episode of millennials and homemaking. An indoor garden is certainly a species of homemaking. So in general, millennials like to do a lot of the things that their parents' generation did not necessarily like to do. So cooking from scratch and baking their own bread and using these iron skillets to create slow food. So Overthink refers to the works of Michel de Certeau and his practices of the everyday life. And they also especially refer to the work of Maria Ortega, who follows de Certeau's work, who talks about emancipatory homemaking. So the idea is not this kind of regressive return to rigid gender roles in times of uncertainty, because it's also men who bake and who have indoor gardens. Rather, the idea is to carve out a space of belonging for oneself in uncertain times, in times when one is more or less powerless to change the system as a whole. So it's about tactics of the everyday life, little steps, little ways of coping, little interventions that provide more favorable situations for oneself. But I also want to talk about the underlying view of the plant that's implied in this term, plant parents. It's a very personal relationship that is implied here. Rather than saying we're plant owners, we refer to ourselves as plant parents. Now, this is also in an attempt to kind of be quirky and hipster about it, but there's also something else to it. If you refer to yourself as a plant owner, you regard the plant as a little more than maybe an object. It's something of instrumental value, of use value. We have plants because they're pretty and they decorate our apartments, or we have plants because we want to produce food, so we grow vegetables, for instance. But none of this is really the case with these millennials with jungle homes. They usually say that they have so many plants because it just makes them happy and it gives them joy. So there's this idea of a personal relationship to their plants. They don't regard the plant merely instrumentally, but they ascribe a clear intrinsic value. They value the plant for the plant's own sake. And while in the history of Western thought, the kind of more functional view was predominant, and it was most famously represented by René Descartes, who thought that both animals and plants are automata, meaning kind of self-moving objects. And this implies that they only kind of live out their pre-programmed genetic script without any agency of their own. But this view is not the only option, and it was not always the dominant view. For instance, if you go back to the antiquity, to Plato, for instance, or Aristotle, there is a thought of a plant's soul. So the idea that plants too have sensations and desires, but in a different way from humans. They're thought to be teleologically organized. Telos means goal, so to have that they're goal-oriented in their own way. So Plato, for instance, talks about leaves turning to the sun and roots seeking water. As one interpretation of Plato argues, the way plants are teleological, the way they seek the good and avoid the bad, is not by thinking about what they want, the way humans do, so that's how they differ from the human soul, but by partaking in the intelligence of the world's soul. And the world's soul is how Plato understood the universe, as a kind of a living and thinking whole. Now, this may not be particularly helpful in today's times when we don't really think of the universe as being a world soul. However, it is an interesting idea to apply to some of the more recent findings on plants that make them seem far more interesting and weird than we thought before. Plants communicate with each other. They send these kind of chemical substances to warn other plants, for instance, when they're being attacked by an insect. And in some cases, birds are able to decode these messages as well, and then they come and attack and eat the insect. And there are other ways in which plants cooperate with other organisms. For instance, in forests, the roots of the trees are entangled with the spores of mushrooms, and trees use these vast networks of mushroom spores to convey messages and to send nourishment. So this might be a way to understand Plato's idea of the plant's soul in today's terms. So the plant soul is intelligent because it partakes in the intelligence of the larger whole, in the teleological organization of the ecosystem in which it is rooted in. Now, of course, not all millennials know this, and they don't have to know this in order to treat their plants differently. Rather, I think that these findings have influenced our cultural climate in a way that it has become, for instance, mainstream to talk to plants, for instance, or that practices like forest bathing have become very common and fashionable. So I would say that this shift in the way the plants are viewed shows more in our behavior towards plants, in our attitude towards plants. We do not just have them for decorative purposes or because they bear fruit that we can eat. Rather, we tacitly acknowledge that they have some sort of agency that is well beyond what we humans can perceive or even sometimes understand.